Society today is composed of a series of institutions. From political institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, to institutions of social class, familial values, and occupational specialization. It is obvious the profound influence these traditionalized structures have in shaping our understandings and perspectives. Yet, of all the social institutions we are born into, directed by, and conditioned upon, there seems to be no system as taken for granted and misunderstood as the monetary system. Taking on nearly religious proportions, the established monetary institution exists as one of the most unquestioned forms of faith there is. How money is created, the policies by which it is governed, and how it truly affects society are unregistered interests of the great majority of the population. In a world where 1% of the population owns 40% of the planet's wealth, in a world where 34,000 children die every single day from poverty and preventable diseases, and where 50% of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day, one thing is clear: something is very wrong. And whether we are aware of it or not, the lifeblood of all of our established institutions, and thus society itself, is money. Therefore, understanding this institution of monetary policy is critical to understanding why our lives are the way they are. Unfortunately, economics is often viewed with confusion and boredom. Endless streams of financial jargon coupled with intimidating mathematics quickly deters people from attempts at understanding it. However, the fact is, the complexity associated with the financial system is a mere mask, designed to conceal one of the most socially paralyzing structures humanity has ever endured. A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And, upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made, and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And, of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion, to 6.5 billion, to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original 10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters. Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is, inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary. For the act of expanding the money supply, without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy, will always debase a currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence. Now, if this reality of inherent and perpetual inflation seems absurd and economically self-defeating, hold that thought, for absurdity is an understatement in regard to how our financial system really operates. For in our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation. In fact, the last time in American history the national debt was completely paid off was in 1835 after President Andrew Jackson shut down the central bank that preceded the Federal Reserve. In fact, Jackson's entire political platform essentially revolved around his commitment to shut down the central bank, stating at one point, "The bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people, should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." Unfortunately, his message was short-lived, and the international bankers succeeded to install another central bank in 1913, the Federal Reserve. And as long as this institution exists, perpetual debt is guaranteed. Now, so far we have discussed the reality that money is created out of debt, through loans. These loans are based on a bank's reserves, and reserves are derived from deposits. And through this fractional reserve system, any one deposit can create 9 times its original value, in turn debasing the existing money supply, raising prices in society. And since all this money is created out of debt, and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists, where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pool enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living. As dysfunctional and backwards as all of this might seem, there is still one thing we have omitted from this equation. And it is this element of the structure which reveals the truly fraudulent nature of the system itself: the application of interest. When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, only what would be referred to as the principal is being created in the money supply. So then, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. The ramifications of this are staggering, for the amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers true wealth from the individual to the banks. For if you are unable to pay for your mortgage, they will take your property. This is particularly enraging when you realize that not only is such a default inevitable due to the fractional reserve practice, but also because of the fact that the money that the bank loaned to you didn't even legally exist in the first place. In 1969, there was a Minnesota court case involving a man named Jerome Daley, who was challenging the foreclosure of his home by the bank which provided the loan to purchase it. His argument was that the mortgage contract required both parties, being he and the bank, each put up a legitimate form of property for the exchange. In legal language, this is called consideration. Mr. Daley explained that the money was, in fact, not the property of the bank, for it was created out of nothing as soon as the loan agreement was signed. Remember what modern money mechanics stated about loans? What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits. Reserves are unchanged by the loan transactions, but deposit credits constitute new additions to the total deposits of the banking system. In other words, the money doesn't come out of their existing assets. The bank is simply inventing it, putting up nothing of its own, except for a theoretical liability on paper. As the court case progressed, the bank's president, Mr. Morgan, took the stand, and in the judge's personal memorandum, he recalled that the plaintiff, bank's president, admitted that, in combination with the Federal Reserve Bank, did create the money and credit upon its books by bookkeeping entry. The money and credit first came into existence when they created it. Mr. Morgan admitted that no United States law or statute existed which gave him the right to do this. A lawful consideration must exist and be tendered to support the note. The jury found that there was no lawful consideration, and I agree. He also poetically added, "Only God can create something of value out of nothing." And upon this revelation, the court rejected the bank's claim for foreclosure, and Daley kept his home. The implications of this court decision are immense. For every time you borrow money from a bank, whether it is a mortgage loan or a credit card charge, the money given to you is not only counterfeit, it is an illegitimate form of consideration, and hence voids the contract to repay, for the bank never had the money as property to begin with. Unfortunately, such legal realizations are suppressed and ignored, and the game of perpetual wealth transfer and perpetual debt continues. And this brings us to the ultimate question: why? During the American Civil War, President Lincoln bypassed the high-interest loans offered by the European banks and decided to do what the Founding Fathers advocated, which was to create an independent and inherently debt-free currency. It was called the greenback. Shortly after this measure was taken, an internal document circulated between private British and American banking interests stated, "Slavery is but the owning of labor, and carries with it the care of laborers, while the European plan is that capital shall control labor by controlling wages. This can be done by controlling the money. It will not do to allow the greenback, as we cannot control that." The fractional reserve policy perpetrated by the Federal Reserve, which has spread in practice to the great majority of banks in the world, is, in fact, a system of modern slavery. Think about it. Money is created out of debt. And what do people do when they are in debt? They submit to employment to pay it off. But if money can only be created out of loans, how can society ever be debt-free? It can't. And that's the point. And it is the fear of losing assets coupled with the struggle to keep up with the perpetual debt and inflation inherent in the system, compounded by the inescapable scarcity within the money supply itself, created by the interest that can never be repaid, that keeps the wage slave in line, running on the hamster wheel with millions of others, in effect powering an empire that truly benefits only the elite at the top of the pyramid. For, at the end of the day, who are you really working for? The banks. Money is created in a bank and invariably ends up in a bank. They are the true masters, along with the corporations and governments they support. Physical slavery requires people to be housed and fed. Economic slavery requires people to feed and house themselves. It is one of the most ingenious scams for social manipulation ever created, and at its core, it is an invisible war against the population. Debt is the weapon used to conquer and enslave societies, and interest is its prime ammunition. And as the majority walks around oblivious to this reality, the banks, in collusion with governments and corporations, continue to perfect and expand their tactics of economic warfare, spawning new bases, such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, while also inventing a new type of soldier, the birth of the economic hitman.
One day, Europe was attacked from inside, and a Europe which had become Christian suddenly lost its Christianity. While Europe was Christian for those centuries, Christian Europe fought a ferocious battle against riba. Yeah, Christian Europe against riba. In fact, one of the best books on riba ever written was written by a British sheikh. What was his name? Shakespeare, correct. William Shakespeare. Which book? Which book? Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice. I will not have the time in this lecture, otherwise you'll have to give me 3 hours, to explain to you the brilliance of William Shakespeare in Merchant of Venice. But you'll get it, that analysis is there in my big book on riba. In Merchant of Venice, you will see Christian Europe in its attempt to ensure the prohibition of riba. There is another book, not as famous as William Shakespeare's, but this one is also a classic. Take a note of it. You might want to search for it in the library. The name of the book is Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. I would make this compulsory reading in Darul Uloom. Oh yes. Religion and the Rise of Capitalism by an author whose name is R.W. Tawney, T-A-W-N-E-Y. And in this book, Tawney records the Christian struggle against riba in Europe. But when the French Revolution occurred, the back of the Christian church was broken in Western Europe. And when was it broken in Eastern Europe? Which revolution? Bolshevik Revolution. How come we're only getting the answers from this corner? The Bolshevik Revolution broke the back of the Christian church in Eastern Europe, in Russia. When once the back of the Christian church was broken in Europe, the Jews were delighted. The Jews were delighted. Because the Christians had been waging a terrific war against the Jews for centuries in Europe. We will not allow you to lend money on interest. And the Jews always wanted to lend money on interest. Why? Because they had changed the Torah. I think I explained this to you. They rewrote the Torah. The Torah that had come down from Allah had prohibited riba. But they changed it, and the Torah now says, in as many words, that it is haram for a Jew to lend money on interest to another Jew. But it is halal, he can lend on interest to those who are not Jews. Go and check it out. Go and check it out in Deuteronomy, in Leviticus. Go and check it out. I have all of these quotations in my book for you. So they are the money lenders. They changed the word of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded to this in the Quran and points out that they had in effect changed the Torah. Where did he do that? Suratun? Which surah? Suratun Nisa. The language, as I said, was very powerful language. فَبِظُلْمٍ مِّنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ طَيِّبَاتٍ أُحِلَّتْ لَهُمْ. In that ayah, he says, وَأَخْذِهِمُ الرِّبَا وَقَدْ نُهُوا عَنْهُ. They were taking riba despite the fact that they had been prohibited from doing so. So this is how we know that they changed the Torah. Now, with the French Revolution, an economy based on riba emerges in Europe for the first time. And then with the Bolshevik Revolution in Eastern Europe, the possibility for Eastern Europe to be embraced by riba is also now open. But the banks in Europe, they don't just lend money on interest. The European economy not only produces this curious creature called a bank, the bank does something more than lending money on interest. What the bank does, and this began in France with an Englishman, what the bank does is to start issuing paper as money. Paper as money. And then when government saw that the banks were getting rich issuing paper as money, then the governments took over the paper. Then Europe sent her armies, and European armies shamelessly, at the point of a sword, those who say Islam was spread at the point of the sword, they're the ones who went with the point of the sword, and conquered the rest of the non-European world. And so a white world order emerges at the point of the sword, in which Europe now rules the world. When Europe took over the rest of the world, one of the most important things that Europe wanted to do was to dismantle the system of real money and replace it with paper money. And they achieved it because the scholars of Islam were eating halwa. Europe would not decolonize and hand over Egypt to Muhammad Naguib and Jamal Abdel Nasser for the drums to be beaten, we are independent, and would not hand over Indonesia to a fellow named Ahmad Sukarno so the Indonesians can jump for joy, we are independent now. And they would not hand over Malaysia to a fellow named Tunku Abdul Rahman, and they would not hand over Pakistan to another fellow named Muhammad Ali Jinnah, etc., 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 etc. And all the natives start dancing, drum beating. We have something called independence. While Europe is laughing its head behind the wall. Look at them. Blind like bats. Europe would not decolonize until Europe was ensured that a new financial system was in place in which real money was now replaced by paper money. At the beginning, when paper money was introduced, it was redeemable for gold. What does redeemable mean? Yes, exchange. In the United States of America, until the 1920s, you could take $20 US in notes, paper, and go to any bank, and you can ask for 1 ounce of gold, and you'll get it. If a man wants to cut your throat, he wouldn't be so silly as to show you the sword, the knife. He has to hide the knife first, all right? Get you to come close. So when paper money was introduced, it was redeemable in gold. And the banks that issued the paper money and the governments that issued the paper money, they gave their word that this is the value of the paper. And they even print on the paper, guess what they printed? In God we trust. Let me show you. Here is a US dollar note, and you can come and see it with your own eyes if you want. It says, in God we trust. In other words, when we give our word to you that 20 American dollars is equivalent to 1 ounce of gold, our word is as good and as solid as the word of God himself. But in 1933, something strange happened that should have caused our ulama to stop eating halwa. Uncle Sam was broke. So guess what Uncle Sam did? Uncle Sam was broke. So guess what Uncle Sam did? In April 1933, Uncle Sam enacted legislation prohibiting all Americans from keeping gold. You have to return any gold that you have, not jewelry. Jewelry you can keep. Any gold that you have as coins or as bullion to Uncle Sam, and he will give you paper. And you have to trust in God that Uncle Sam's word is as good as the word of God. So all of America gave their gold to Uncle Sam, meaning the US government. If they caught you with gold after a certain date, then you could be fined 10,000 US dollars and spend 6 months as a guest of Uncle Sam in one of his prisons. So all of America went and gave their gold and took the paper. After Uncle Sam had collected all the gold, guess what he did? He gave his word, but he changed his word. This is called values. These are the people who today rule the world. They gave their word, and they broke their word. Uncle Sam changed the price of gold from $20 an ounce of gold to $35 an ounce of gold. The American people woke up that morning and said, our own government ripped us off. Yes, it was your own government that ripped you off. And then Uncle Sam made it known, you better come back and buy your gold quick before I change the price again. So the American people had to go and buy back their gold from Uncle Sam at $35 an ounce. And in the process, Uncle Sam ripped off the American people of almost half of their wealth. The Prophet said, sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, this transaction is one based on deception, through which you get a profit to which you are not entitled. The Prophet ﷺ described this as riba. How is it taking place? They started with gold, paper being redeemable in gold. And then came 1933, when we should have woken up to see their game. But we didn't wake up. So in 1944, at the end of the Second World War, they now consolidated the system in the creation of an international monetary system now. Consolidated. The new international monetary system emerges out of the Bretton Woods Agreement in upstate New York. Is it taught in the Darul Room? No, it's not. At Bretton Woods, what did they do? They said, no longer will paper be redeemable in gold. Only one paper will be chosen to be redeemable in gold. All the rest will not. The one paper which was chosen was the US dollar. So the US dollar will be redeemable in gold, but not sterling pound, and not Pakistani rupee, and not Indonesian rupiah, not Australian dollar. No, only one. So this is a major blow to the integrity of money. The second thing that they did was to declare that the only people who could come to Uncle Sam to redeem their paper for gold are governments. You and I can't do it. Only governments, only central banks. So now the entire system has lost 99% of its integrity. It has only 1% left of integrity, but those fellows are still eating halwa. 1% integrity left. That governments, central banks can go to Uncle Sam with their US dollars and demand the gold. Nobody did. From 1944 to 1971, nobody did. The Vietnam War took place in the late 60s, and Uncle Sam printed a lot of paper to finance the war. And Uncle Sam didn't have the gold to back that paper. At Bretton Woods, they had fixed the price of gold at $35 an ounce. Fixed. It is there in the Bretton Woods Accord. Uncle Sam didn't have the gold to back all that paper. So in September 1971, the British government came in one Friday evening, perhaps, with $3 billion and said, Uncle Sam, we want the gold. Uncle Sam knew that the game was up. The game was up. Because come Monday morning, guess who is going to be at the front of the line? Saudi Arabia. Or who behind Saudi Arabia? Kuwait. Huh? And a whole long line of people, of government, central banks, we want the gold. So Richard Nixon retired to Camp David, and then on Sunday he had addressed the American people, and he said, we gave our word, but we don't have to keep our word. We gave our word, but we don't have to keep our word. We will no longer honor our obligation under Bretton Woods to redeem paper for gold from central banks. And so since September 1971, this may be news for some of you who've been eating halwa. Since September 1971, there is no legal link between paper and gold. It's gone.
So to argue that we can continue to do this, to continue to debase the currency, which is really the policy that we're following, is purposely debasing, devaluing a currency, which to me seems so destructive. It destroys the incentives to save. It destroys, and if you don't save, you don't have capital. Then it just puts more pressure on the Federal Reserve to create capital out of thin air in order to stimulate the economy. And usually that just goes into malinvestment, misdirected investment into the housing bubbles or the NASDAQ bubble. And then the effort is, once the market demands the correction, what tool do you have left? Let's keep pumping, pump, pump, pump. And it just is an endless task. And history is against you. I mean, history is on the side of hard money. If you look at stable prices, you have to look to the only historic sound money that's lasted more than a few years. Fiat money always in. Gold is the only thing where you can get stable prices.
Meet Uncle Sam. He has a lot of bills to pay. Almost $4 trillion worth every year. Uncle Sam's income is a little over $2 trillion per year. To make up the difference, the deficit, he does what most Americans do. He borrows money. When Uncle Sam takes out a loan, he calls it a bond. Bonds can be held by banks, investors, or even foreign governments. Uncle Sam has to promise to pay interest on these bonds, just as you do on any loan you take out. Ever think about paying your mortgage with your credit card? That's exactly what Uncle Sam does. He takes out new loans, new bonds, so that he can make payments on the old ones. All those loans, and especially all that interest, adds up. Right now, Uncle Sam owes about $14 trillion. To put that in perspective, 14 trillion is about the same as the national GDP, the total value of all the goods and services produced by the American economy in an entire year. It's such a huge amount of money that Uncle Sam is starting to run out of people to borrow from, and he's having trouble just paying the interest on his loans. The obvious solution would be to either cut spending or increase taxes. But if he cuts spending, the people that he's spending money on would complain that they don't have money to spend, and that he was hurting the economy. If he tried to raise taxes enough to close this gap, not only would people definitely have less money to spend, he'd probably have riots on his hands. So Uncle Sam chooses the easy way to make money. Just make it. He calls up the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, and, like magic, dollars are created and deposited in banks all around America. The problem is that the more of something there is, the less it's worth. Same goes for the US dollar. The more dollars there are, the less each one will buy. That's why commodities like gasoline, food, and gold become more expensive when Uncle Sam does his money-making magic. The commodities aren't really worth more. Your money is just worth less. That's called inflation. Remember the foreign governments that lent money to Uncle Sam? When they lent money to the American government, something interesting happened. It made the U.S. look richer, and their countries look poorer. When a country looks poor compared to America, $1 of our money buys a lot of their money, so they can pay their workers only a few pennies a day. With such low labor costs, they can sell their products in America for lower prices than any American manufacturer can. The easiest way for American companies to compete is to move their factories overseas and pay their workers a few pennies a day too. This contributes to a recession. Americans lose their jobs, stop paying taxes, and start collecting government benefits like Medicaid and unemployment. This means that Uncle Sam has even less income and even more expenses. At the same time, the people who still have jobs are desperate to keep them, so they tend to do more work but not to get paid anymore. When your dollars are worth less and you're not earning more of them, that's called stagflation. And this is why Uncle Sam is in a catch-22. He can't raise taxes or cut spending without making the recession worse. And he can't have the Federal Reserve create more money without making inflation worse. For now, he can keep borrowing money, but since he can't even pay the interest on the loans he already has, it just makes his inevitable bankruptcy even worse. Whether it's in 2 months or 2 years, the day will come when Uncle Sam can no longer pay his bills. When that happens, the banks, investors, and foreign governments who are counting on that money won't be able to pay their bills. You see, just like Uncle Sam, governments, banks, and corporations don't actually have much money. Mostly, all they have is debt to each other. If one link in the debt chain stops paying, defaults, the whole thing falls apart. If investors can't pay their bills, corporations won't be able to pay their employees. If banks can't pay their bills, you won't be able to take out a loan, use a credit card, or even withdraw your savings. If foreign governments can't pay their bills, their own banks and corporations will have the same problems. That's called a global economic collapse. It's never happened before, so nobody really knows how bad it will be, how long it will last, or even how we'll eventually get out of it. The house of cards has already been built. There's no painless way to dismantle it now. All we can do is to educate each other about what's actually going on, and to prepare for what may be very extraordinary circumstances.
Stephen, I would like you to, if you can, explain this pie chart to America on our spending here, our money problems. Can you explain this?
Well, we have multiple national debts, Glenn. We don't just have one national debt. Everyone knows that we owe $8 to $10 trillion in the accumulated budget deficits that we owe, but then we also owe somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $55 trillion, and that's trillion with a T, in money that we owe in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, money that we don't have coming into the system. That is promises we made over what we're going to collect into the system. And then on top of that, Glenn, there's $16 billion that we've calculated.
Trillion.
Did I say
You said billion. I mean, what are you?
Even I'm guilty.
Hello. Billion's a made-up word. Let's use real numbers like trillion.
16 trillion, and those are guarantees that we've made on everything from student loans to pensions to virtually every mortgage in America today is guaranteed payment by the federal government.
All right, now let me show you the total of what these things cost. The total is $78.8 trillion. Right. The reason why this pie chart has been made into a globe for you is to have you really understand this next number. Here it is. The world GDP is $78.4 trillion. It takes the entire world a year to pay off our debt. That's staggering.